Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar. And thank you very much for joining us on the call today. Barb and I will be covering the topic of how journey mapping can inform design decisions. Today I'll take you through a brief introduction before Barb leads us into a section on what's a journey map anyway, and then starts us off with an example journey map that we're going to build upon during our webinar. After that, I'll provide you with some research methods that you can use to inform your journey map, and I'll give you some tips on how to go about choosing an appropriate method for the type of information you're trying to find for your map. From there, I will show you how we can use these different types of research methods to provide content to our example journey map. And then Barb will wrap up our talk by pulling it all together in our section, So What Have We Learned? Let's begin with our intro. Barb and I work for Macadamian Technologies, and we're part of the user experience group here. I'm a user experience researcher, and Barb is an interaction designer. Today we're going to be leveraging our healthcare experience to provide you with some in-depth examples during our webinar, but this approach applies to any industry, and we'll do our best to provide you with these examples as well. Brian, one of our attendees today, sent us a question ahead of time asking about the risks of creating journey maps without direct access to end users and relying only on subject matter experts. So we thought we'd address this question right away. As we're looking at a healthcare journey map today, Barbara and I work a lot in experience maps and some aspects of healthcare, but we are not the subject of the journey map, and we're not the ones involved in the journey. Instead, we're going to talk to you about the end users that we would have involved in the journey. So to answer Brian's question, yes and no. It is valuable to do a journey mapping exercise without extensive or complete input from real end users. It's a very good way to identify gaps in your understanding of their experience and to identify where you're making assumptions. From there, you can structure your research efforts to fill these gaps and to validate your assumptions, rather than aimlessly researching things that may or may not feed into the questions you're trying to answer. So yes, it is worthwhile, but no, you can't consider it an accurate journey map on which you're basing product or service design decisions until you know it reflects the real end user experience. All that to say, we are by no means the clinicians that we design for, and we don't try to be. Instead, we involve the primary user groups of the products and services we design for, like clinicians or patients, in a number of different fashions for our maps. We'll discuss these ways further on in our webinar today. So I'll now pass on this next section on to Barb, who will talk to us about what's a journey map anyway.
So what is a journey map? A journey map is a holistic view of all the touch points or interactions that people are going to have with or related to a product or service. What it does is it lets you determine many key factors. They'll help you identify the opportunities you have to innovate during the experience with your product or service that you are designing. It's also essentially just a tool. It's one of many tools that are used to inform the design process. It tends to fit well at specific stages of the product defining and designing and developing process, usually somewhere after you've established your business strategy and somewhere before you've gone too deep into the product strategy. And instead of going deep into product design debates where individual stakeholders bring their own agendas to the table, mapping out your user's journey allows your organization to share a common frame of reference that centers around the user's experience, not these biases and agendas. And like any tool, it's not the act of using a specific tool that gives you a successful product. You can absolutely build a great product without ever making a journey map, and you can create a beautiful journey map and still end up with a horrible product. Simply going through the motions of journey mapping isn't enough. You need to use these key insights throughout your team and organization and have them feed into every stakeholder's role and contribution to the project. So we have a few examples of journey maps to show you today before we go into the details about the bits and pieces that make up a journey map. These maps were created for various industries at different levels of fidelity for different reasons and at different points in the product design process. The purpose of a map will determine the level of fidelity that you try to achieve. So who's going to be looking at it? Where is it going to go? Is it going to land, presented to a bunch of stakeholders to buy into something, or is it going to just sit in your sketchbook and be there for reference only? So if you're doing giving a new product some kind of direction, you're going to do a very exploratory map to sort of map out the space. If you're taking an existing product service to some sort of a redesign effort, you're going to want to identify the current pain points or inefficiencies of what you have before deciding what those changes should be. If you're trying to get buy-in for a change that you're trying to make, it's a very good way to communicate research findings in a very easy to understand manner, because it's very visual and graphical that way. Or simply you might want to create a journey map to wrap your own head around a user experience that you don't think you understand completely. You'll see that these example journey maps we're sharing, they all look quite different from one another. You'll usually not know in advance what kinds of insights you're going to gain until you've mapped out the journey. So you go into the process with your mind and your eyes wide open to learning. As you gather the research and you start massaging the findings, the map starts to take shape. So there's no such thing as a blank journey map template. We often get asked for something like that you can just fill in with your data. Because the map's shape and form is really defined by the data and the information that you've put into it. Also, getting back to the topic of the fidelity level, you'll see that this journey map is a lot less polished and detailed than the last two ones that I showed. This one was created just really quickly between two routine design review meetings within the project, simply to get a common understanding between the team members about the movement of information between the people involved in a specific experience. Once the team had that common understanding, this journey map was done. There was no need to continue polishing it or prettying it. That was just, it had served its purpose and we moved on. To go a little further, this was something that I scribbled by myself, for myself, to understand the main events and the brief experience of a product I was designing for. Once I understood it, it essentially stayed in my sketchbook. And occasionally I pulled it up to, reference during discussions with team members to make sure that we could all share that understanding that this helped me gain. And the last sample journey map I'm going to show you is this one. This is sort of the extreme of not pretty and pulled together. It was done with a group of stakeholders in a boardroom in about half an hour. Each person involved in this mapping exercise was so deeply buried in their own role and bias and so on, that this exercise really helped everyone develop a common understanding of the bigger picture and why problems were occurring at key points. The insight was gained at this point. We could have gone on from this to pretty it up and make it into a shiny deliverable, but the value of the mapping experience was already achieved at this level of fidelity. So you don't have to feel that you don't draw well enough and you don't have enough visual design skills to journey map. It really is about information. So from here, now that you've seen a couple examples and I've told you that there's no generic template, we'll dissect the journey map a little bit and get a sense of the components that often do end up in journey maps. So there's a couple of them. We'll start with the timeline. So since we're calling it a journey map, by definition there is a journey, there is a line which gets followed. This can be a straight line with an start point and an end point. It could be cyclical, there could be multiple entry points, multiple endings, and so on. But essentially, it's the journey that your users are going to take throughout their experience. On that line, on that journey, on that timeline, there will be events and activities that occur at specific points. This could be something that happens to your user, it could be something that your user does, it could be a decision that your user makes, or information or insight they've gained. These sorts of things that happen along the journey are things you're going to want to plot onto your map. Once you've mapped out the individual activities, you might find that they fall into more broad groups or phases. As your user moves from one of these phases to the next, often their conditions, their context, or their frame of mind might change. There may be specific milestones as you move from one to the next, or maybe a very gradual progression from one phase to the next. There's also a bunch of other information that you are going to collect as you go that might not fit neatly anywhere onto your map. So these could be things like user demographic information, traits about your user that's relevant to their journey, their preferences, their attitudes, anything that you feel needs to be communicated but doesn't really belong on the map itself. These sorts of things you want to document somewhere to make sure that they are kept in mind and contributing to the context that you're trying to create and the big picture that you're trying to paint. There's also touch points that we like to document on a journey map. So these tend to be interactions of the user with other people, other products, other services. And in the context of product design, your user's points of contact with these other people, places, things are very important to be aware of. That's often where you can keep track of your opportunity to innovate or improve upon what you have. The next thing that we tend to map on journey maps are relative highs and lows of the experience or the journey. These tend to be physical and emotional attributes that can rise and fall as you go through different points and different activities and different phases. And it's very worthwhile knowing what these are in terms of how open your users may be to various things that you're trying to push upon them. And then finally, once you've done all of that, hopefully some insights will emerge. You'll see pain points and opportunities, and this is much more easily said than done, of course, but as we walk through the journey mapping exercise today, you're going to see the sorts of things to look for in your map. So often, all of these are in a journey map. Sometimes only some of them fall in. Sometimes you add other elements that we haven't mentioned here. But these are kind of the common building blocks of a journey map that you can try to look for as you start to build them. And this will sort of put some structure to the exercise of trying to gather this information. Okay, so what are we mapping today? As we mentioned earlier, I think in the introduction, the map that we are mapping is healthcare related. We're going to look at mapping the experience of a woman going through doctor-assisted labor and delivery in a hospital. We're going to assume a couple things. It's an uncomplicated labor and delivery, it's supported by a partner throughout, and that there's a brief stay in the hospital post-birth. We're going to take a second here to talk about the scope of a journey map. You can, of course, imagine that a woman going through labor and delivery, that's one journey from that first contraction until the delivery. You can also picture a broader journey of the entire pregnancy starting 9 months earlier. You can even go more big picture and think of that woman's experience of her whole journey of motherhood. Or you can go in the opposite direction and think much more granular and maybe zoom in on a very small part of the delivery experience, perhaps everything from when the baby is born until they are discharged and that confusion and all those things that happen then. So the sort of scope and level of granularity that you choose needs to be defined up front so that you know what you're really looking at. And we also had a question sent to us related to this by Anne that we're going to answer now as well. And she was asking more specifically about how users might change from one persona to another over time. So you can imagine that this fictional woman whose journey we're mapping today, let's say she goes through an uncomplicated pregnancy, delivery, and all that, and everything's fine. If she's pregnant again and then has this higher risk, complicated triplet birth, it's still the same person, but it's a very different persona, and absolutely you would want to map that differently. They're separate journeys, they're separate maps. Trying to merge them into a single one would result in, you wouldn't really be able to find the sorts of insights that you can find if you're a bit more targeted in your mapping. So that's the experience that we'll be mapping today. And what are we trying to do? Why are we trying to map it? So we want to look at the journey more holistically. We want to see where more support is needed and also where it's wanted, because that's not always the same thing. We want to consider who or what can offer that kind of support. And we want to identify pain points and opportunities along that journey. So let's map what we know. What do we already know? Assuming you're working with some subject matter experts and that you have a good interdisciplinary team contributing to your project, you often do have some knowledge to start sketching out your map. In this case, there are some concrete milestones that will let us set the scope and define some inherent phases into the journey. So if we start with the timeline, that essentially is our scope. It's from the onset of labor through delivery to going home. That would be the timeline that we define for it. In terms of events and activities, there are some concrete milestones that are common to all labor experiences. We know that at some point, the baby is born. That's going to happen. So that is something that we know going in. We know a little bit about the sorts of phases that can exist. There are some inherent labor phases that are relevant to the physical process of labor. So we can potentially use those to give some structure to the phases within our map. We'd probably want to validate further and see what other phases exist that do not map directly to physical experiences. As for related information, we'd be making lots of assumptions. I mean, we know they're all women, but beyond that, we can't necessarily capture a lot of that related information with accuracy without doing some research. Same with touch points. We know some of this. We know there's going to be a clinician involved at various points. We know that there's likely a partner around, but we'd be making some assumptions around what they are doing and when. As for the relatives' highs and lows, I mean, we know that there will be highs and lows through this journey. Plotting them without research would be, again, making assumptions. And then finally, the pain points and opportunities. If we try and come in thinking we know them, then we're sort of defeating the purpose of mapping the journey. So we'll determine those at the end. So this is what we know, mapped out very loosely. We have a start point from that first contraction. We have an end point, the baby's brought home. We've got two little events in the middle. We're assuming that there are some phases that we maybe can bucket our events into. And we've sort of got these two touch points at the bottom, the partner and the clinicians. So in terms of a very loose structure to a map, that's what we're starting with. And so what's missing? An awful lot, right? That's the most sparse of the journey maps we've shown today. So if you come back to this list, we can start to look at the things that are missing. So the timeline, well, is that the only way it goes? Are there any loops? Are there any branches that could happen here? Are there events and activities missing? Absolutely. Are the phases right? Let's find out, and so on. So we're going to go through this list and identify how we can gain this information through various research techniques. So I'm going to pass it back over to Anneliis for that.
Great. Thank you, Barb. So as you might already know or are starting to understand, journey maps are not a thought experiment. You shouldn't rely on your memory or your imagination alone. It's easy to assume you know what happens, especially if you have had the experience yourself a lot, but you may be missing key insights. So I'd like to cover some research methods that you can use to inform your journey map. I'm going to cover 6 methods that we found most useful and then lead us into how to go about choosing a method to inform your map. So first up, questionnaires. Questionnaires can be used for collecting data about preferences, behaviors, facts, latent traits, and attitudes. So they're a cheap and effective way of capturing information. You can do it remotely, like online, and responses are standardized. They're ideal for gathering data from a geographically spread user base. You can get lots of data points easily using this. And you can use this method when you need answers that are relative, so better or worse. However, there is a limited set of questions that can be included in a questionnaire, so it can't go on forever. Questionnaires are one-sided, so you can't get answers to the questions or additional answers or probe into those responses further, so you may miss out on some interesting information. And of course, inherently now, these questions often result in additional questions, so there's no recourse if you want more information on an answer to a question. Next up are focus groups. Focus group is a group of interacting individuals. They've got some common interests or characteristics, and there's typically a moderator or moderators using the group, and its interaction is a way of gathering information about a specific issue. So they help us provide us with attitudinal data. They can often be quick and cost-effective way to gather qualitative information. But things you need to watch out for is that your participants in the focus group may be imagining their interaction with a product or a service. They can also be susceptible to groupthink, so participants could be swayed by others. And sometimes it's harder to detect true patterns across individuals because the exercise does not provide independent opinions. Next up are interviews. So interviews help us better understanding the user's goals and needs by actually talking with them. They can be semi-structured or unstructured interviews, and they're often used to elicit scenarios. So you get direct response from your interviewee and feedback. There's opportunities to probe so that topics can be explored in depth, and it really yields rich data and details and new insights. It's also a really flexible method, which can also be something you should watch out for, because if it's semi-structured, it can be quite costly in analysis, or you have a lot of data to go through, so it can be a time-consuming process as well. Our next method is observation. So an observation exercise is a technique where you observe actual users or representative users in their natural environment through the whole process of using a particular product or system. So this technique is used to understand the nature of the tasks and the context in which they are performed. So it provides a deep understanding of the user's lifestyles, cultures, process, and workarounds as a basis for better understanding their needs and problems. So you get a collection of detailed, descriptive narrative data about the user's profile, product usage, and it's really great for capturing environmental factors, so how a product is used. So you do need to conduct this research exercise in the work environment, which may have its own limitations and distractions, so something to look out for as well. Scheduling the session can be a bit difficult or a challenge. How much time, when to observe, whom to observe, and a great deal of expertise and objectivity is required for this. Your observers also do have to watch out that they don't influence the user and skew any results. Next up is contextual inquiry. This involves collecting detailed information about a user's work practice by observing and interviewing the user while they work. The researcher should stay in the background and let the user lead the situation as much as possible. So it gives you a chance to really see what's happening and clarify right away in context. It provides data about environmental factors, and it's really a critical source of information for persona and scenario development. The analysis of from this type of method on the data relies on the capabilities of the observer. And perhaps there is no possibility of follow-up or probing, which means it is possible to make wrong conclusions. Last up is more research. There are numerous other research techniques that I did not mention that could be used. You could study documentation. So manuals or other documentation are a good source of data about the steps involved in an activity or any regulations governing a task. So documentation like this, it shouldn't be used as the only source of data, as everyday practices may have been augmented to make procedures work in a practical setting. So you have to make sure you take that user-centered view, and you should be interested in the everyday practices rather than an idealized account. Other sources of information for your map could also be analytics or customer support calls. So choosing a method. Let's move on to this section next. At this point, you should already know your goal, so why you're doing the research. So you need to figure out which data gathering technique you should use to inform your map. The techniques I mentioned all have their pros and cons. I outlined some of those for us. Other forces that come into play are the nature of the journey, the participants, the analyst, any resources that are available, and a multitude of other factors. So you may find yourself combining more than one research technique in order to be able to interpret data that may be unclear. So to help you understand what methods to use, it is useful to realize that they differ along different dimensions, and so inherently they give you different types of information for your map. So a map should have some qualitative and quantitative information in order for it to take shape in a meaningful way, like Barb mentioned earlier. So qualitative studies usually gather data directly, whereas quantitative studies, the data is gathered indirectly through an instrument like a survey. So qualitative research really helps answer the question why. Data is typically gathered directly by observing or interacting with the user. Researcher can ask follow-up questions, probe on behavior, possibly adjust any kind of observation protocol as the study progresses. And the analysis of the data is not mathematical. And the examples I provided to you before were focus groups and interviews. Quantitative research answers the question how many or how much. There's typically large amounts of data. Can be easily coded and analyzed mathematically. An example here that I brought up earlier are questionnaires. So next we have attitudinal versus behavioral in this dimension. So this distinction can be summed up by contrasting what people say with what people do. They're very often quite different. So attitudinal research, the what people say, you understand, you measure, or inform change of people's stated beliefs. They're often the self-reported data. And we've got some example methods here like questionnaires, focus groups, and interviews. The behavioral research, the what people do, you understand what people do with minimal interference from the method itself, like the observation tool I mentioned earlier. We're also seeing blend of mixed approaches here, so mix of attitudinal and behavioral data come out from such techniques as contextual inquiry. So, what type of information do you need? Due to the nature of the differences, qualitative methods are much better suited for answering the question why or how to fix a problem. Whereas on the right-hand side, as you go further along that axis, whereas quantitative data and methods do a much better job answering how many and how much type of questions. So this chart illustrates how the dimensions affect the types of questions that can be asked. So before we start adding to our map, we'll take a break now and address some questions that have come in.
Sure, thanks Anneliis. We've got quite a few questions coming through on the chat window. The first is, how does the journey map articulate the assumptions since they seem to be very relevant constraints on the view? This comes from Drew Ellis.
Sure. So I think how a journey map communicates assumptions, I think that depends on where your journey map's going to end up. If it's an in-progress journey map, all those involved in the mapping of that journey map should know. You will be aware of what you gathered through authentic research techniques versus what has just been assumed by your group. So if it is an in-progress journey map, I think the team as a whole should know that that's an assumption that you're working with. If you've done everything you can and there are certain things you just can't fill in with real data, and that's reality too, you simply state that, you say this area here. And again, it depends who's going to be consuming it. If it's the team who created the map who will be consuming it, they will know. If you're passing it on to another group who's then going to act on it, that's where you would sort of indicate and say, these are assumptions. decisions made around this are risky. There's no graphical way of dotted lines being assumptions or anything like that. But really, it's just a matter of communicating it, and depending on who will end up consuming that map, making sure that they understand that. I hope that answers your question.
So, question from Lawrence. Can an entire customer organization or department be the subject of a single journey map rather than focusing on a single person's journey?
That's an interesting point. I think Barb raised this earlier as well, where she was speaking about how a user or an archetype can take on different personas. And if indeed their situation is different and they've got different behavioral patterns, that does typically mean a new map, because their journey is going to be inherently different.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're understanding your question correctly. So the other part that I kind of heard in there is a journey map based on a single person's experience? And the answer is absolutely not. It's based on a single persona. So this would be many people sharing the same qualities and behaviors that Anneliis just described. So different people within an organization will have a place on that journey map. So those may be touch points, those may be, if you're trying to optimize something for your customers, that's different than optimizing it for your salespeople, which is different than optimizing it for your employees, So depending on who is at the center of that map, they are either the user or they are a touch point or contact or another contributor. I hope some part of that makes sense.
So we have a question that came in from Ted. He'd like you to share some examples where gathering of data was challenging or perhaps not available based on client constraints. For example, are your research methods ever constraints? For example, are your research methods ever stifled because a client doesn't have a big enough budget?
That's a fantastic question, and yes, I've been in that scenario before. So we don't always have the opportunity, for example, to do contextual inquiry, which can be very challenging because of the location that you need to get to, or those user groups that you're trying to get a hold of, and shadowing them around for an entire day. So we have had challenges before trying to execute those types of methods. So like I mentioned previously, your journey map will often use a variety of research techniques. So instead, then we've had to find other ways to get at the same type of data. For example, instead of using contextual inquiry, perhaps we can have the opportunity to jump on a phone call remotely and conduct an interview instead with these user groups. So budget and time are definitely two huge constraints we've had to deal with when creating these types of experience maps.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll proceed and take a few more at the end of the session. So, Barb or Anneliis, is there a difference between journey maps and experience maps?
Anneliis and I were just debating this an hour ago. So probably. I have a feeling that they still do mean slightly different things to different people. Yeah, even between the two of us, we disagreed a little bit on this. So I think, yes, I think a journey implies that there is some direction to what's happening. The journey implies a direction, that there is kind of a beginning, middle, and end. There may be cycles within that. Experience, to me, implies a little bit more that you simply immerse yourself in something. But even there are sort of inherent processes that may be followed. Right. I'm gonna give you a solid. I'm not sure. I feel on the fence about that.
I can add one more point to it as well. I'll agree with the I'm not sure. We've heard some people using experience maps and others journey maps, and sometimes they are the same thing and sometimes they're quite different. What I've seen as well from others is that sometimes journey maps tend to be longer timelines, experiences smaller, and then usage scenarios or scenarios even smaller, and then touch point the smallest scope. So sometimes people have used the terminology different there to give a sense of the scope of the entire map. But inherently there may be some differences.
We'd love to hear if you have an answer that's better than ours too.
Thanks, guys. So we'll move on, and then we'll continue with the question and answer period at the end of the presentation.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so where were we? This is where we first began our map. We had a couple of labor stages in the timeline, some events and activities. We were missing a lot of information still, as Barb alluded to earlier when we first saw this map. So how do we fill the gaps? So we can fill out this map based on what we've learned today. So here are research methods on the left-hand side that I covered earlier, and here's how they might map to the different areas that need more information. As we can see, there are some pieces of information that can be discovered from a variety of techniques, and these should be assessed by your project team in accordance to factors like budget, schedule, and expertise, which I just spoke to in our Q&A session there. So for the purposes of today's webinar, let's see how some of these techniques may inform our patient journey map. So observation. An observation exercise can give us more points along our timeline and some critical events. As you can see, some of these are repetitive loops now coming along our timeline in our event cycle. Observation may also give us an idea of the touch points that our persona has with a partner, a clinician, family and friends, and perhaps technology as well. So we can start to include this on our map. We can also leverage surveys. So a survey may give us the related information we need to answer the questions, like I mentioned before, how many and how much. And as you can see, we've added some statistics to the bottom of our map. For example, how many children has the mother had previously? A survey may inform us of more events as well. So we added some additional events to the beginning and end of our journey now as well. We can also leverage interviews as a research method. So conducting some interviews with this patient demographic may give you the information you need to map the emotional highs and lows that this persona is experiencing during labor and delivery. Here we wanted to represent contrasting emotions during the journey. So the pink represents the elation the mother-to-be is experiencing, and blue represents anxiety that she may be experiencing. You may also gain insights of the physical highs and lows during this journey from interviews and have the ability to map this. So in our context, the physical pain a woman giving birth experience gives us some fantastic insights, and this is mapped in gray. Interviews could also give you the opportunity to learn of more events and probe on these experiences. So you can see we added another loop, like the one at the beginning, in which the mother may be sent home until labor has been confirmed. So finally, this research technique could also give you an understanding of other personal related information, like the questions, concerns, needs, wishes that a woman giving birth is thinking. So since this research technique is semi-structured or perhaps even unstructured, it allows you the opportunity to probe and follow up with your interviewees, and this may help you refine your phases and milestones. So we've now distinctly modified our phases. For example, the last phase was simply recovery before, and now includes both a post-birth phase and a recovery phase. So you can see we've got quite a lot of information now going on our map. It's quite jammed. We've got lots of information here as well from all these different research methods. One interesting one I'd like to bring up here is contextual interviews. So it's very important to keep in mind the context in which you're conducting your research. For example, in the case of mapping our patient experience of a woman giving birth, perhaps contextual inquiry is not the best idea. So after you've done all your great research and updated your map, it's time for some cleanup.
So you might be done now with the map looking like this, if you're just trying to inform yourself and your team. But if you want to pass it on to somebody who wasn't part of the map building process, this goes back to one of the questions we had just a few minutes ago. If you weren't part of building this, you might need to have it cleaned up a little bit so that you can actually understand the information. And also, it's only at this point, once you've plotted everything on there, that you know what you want to highlight and that you know what you want to bring attention to and potentially what you can remove because it's not contributing to the message you're trying to represent here. So once you've cleaned it up a bit, formed it to showcase the information you're mapping, it can start to look a little bit more like this. Maybe all of the events on there weren't essential to communicating it. Maybe some of them could be lumped into bigger events, that kind of stuff. You might also do something like pull in a legend to represent things that you're trying to communicate. So, what's a possible path? What's a path everybody takes? Those kinds of things you want to sort of bring forward. And again, this is useful if this journey map is going to live on without you accompanying it. It has to speak for itself. So once you've come this far, you want to find out what your map is telling you, right? You want to look at it, and some things will start to jump out. You're going to want to start to identify the pain points and opportunities, as we discussed earlier. You might want to jump in and start designing right away, but wait, you might need to do more research. So if we start thinking about pain points and opportunities in this specific example we're looking at, there's a couple of things to look at. So where pain and anxiety are low, but elation is high, so that's the very, very beginning there, that first little blue smiley. This user might have, this patient might have a lot of energy and focus to dedicate to an app or a service that might interest them. The things that might interest now is, they might want to throw themselves into the whole labor process. I mean, they've been waiting for this for so long, they're so excited, and they're not really in much pain yet. So the physical demands on them are quite low, so they might want to start to track or document their labor somehow. They might be excited to communicate with everyone. So they're kind of in this point where they have a lot of attention to give to something, right? As time goes on, the anxiety and pain start to increase, and the elation's kind of waning. The labor is still likely not all-consuming, but if things are progressing rather slowly, the mother may have different needs at that point. May want to be reassured that things are progressing well, may want to find specific ways to actively help labor progress. So the needs start to change as this journey moves on. Going on a little bit further, as time passes, this point pain potentially could be quite high, anxiety might be very high as well, and elation again could be waning. There could be this feeling of, is this baby ever coming? And at this point, encouragement is needed, but labor is very likely much more physically demanding, and the mother's energy and focus is really not going to go to an app or a service that you're trying to design for them. They might welcome support, but they are not going to give anything at this point, whereas at the beginning, they probably had a lot of energy to give. So moving on, eventually the baby's born, and there's that sort of initial, is the baby okay anxiety, and then there's this sort of lovely intimate moment where between the baby and the parents. And although this part on the map might look similar to the part earlier on, where elation was high, pain and anxiety were low, there's something else going on here, because of course there's this moment of undisturbed intimacy that they want. So although the map looks the same, the context and stuff that you've gained through mapping it all out, you realize that this is a very different moment. So they probably don't want to have apps and services shoved into their face at that point. They want that moment to themselves. And then moving on a bit further, after baby's born, everyone's deemed healthy and the family's told, everyone knows what's going on. There might be this sharp drop in attention from all the touch points. Suddenly there's this, lonely, overwhelming feeling that might happen. And there's also a sharp drop in clinical attention. And this might be scary to new parents, especially when they go home and there's this whole new set of routines and roles and habits being established as the family adjusts to their new life. So there's a whole other opportunity there to sort of to fill this gap. So what can you or your product or your service do? Where can you design a solution? This map will then allow you to think about things like, is your patient open to accepting your solution? And we saw a couple points on the map where they likely are not open to it. What do you know about their context that will help you design? This could be even little things like, is their phone still charged? 6 hours into this. Focus groups and interviews explore pain points and opportunities. And as you start to come up with ideas and design solutions, you can continue doing some research, as Anneliis said, to then validate some of the ideas you're having for specific points along this journey. So we actually did look down into some existing solutions. And it was interesting to look at how these things would then map onto the journey map that we've just drawn out here. And it's interesting to see what they're trying to solve and whether they align with the things that we found on our map. So I don't know much about these products, but simply by looking at them, you can get a rough sense of what they're trying to do. And if you sort of plot them onto our map, they do actually relate quite interestingly to some of the pain points and opportunities that we identified. So, this idea of, early labor, new parents being super excited to do something, they would love an app that lets them track this kind of stuff, I'd be curious to see how much those get used towards the last couple hours of labor. I don't know. Things like at the end here, the ability to announce your baby's birth to family and friends. Actual physical products that can potentially transition you from this high pain, high anxiety moment without needing to move from bed to bed because you're actually changing stages in your labor. You can sort of see how these products do fit into specific points and needs that exist on this journey. I don't know if they did the journey map, but they do fall into some of these things. So essentially, the sort of all comes back to how can you use experience maps. They're meant to facilitate and stimulate change within your product and how you approach meeting the needs of your customers. They're not an end, but they're rather a springboard for evolving your product or service. It really does help your team rally around the experience and help them to make decisions. It enables businesses and organizations to determine where to focus their resources. So like we mentioned earlier, to focus your research efforts, to know where there's ambiguity, to know where you think there's opportunity. It also helps stakeholders empathize with their customers, putting them in their customers' shoes, which is a very useful thing. And it just visualizes the journey of what their customers are going through, which helps you make the right decisions. So thank you from both of us. And I do believe we have time for questions.
That's great. We've got tons here, so let's get started then.
Right.
So we have a question from AJ. He wants to know, what is a good method to conduct direct customer interviews? Who should be involved, and any pitfalls we should avoid?
Oh, that's a great question. So how to use the research method and that technique of interviews was the question, and who should be involved. So I think it brings us back to the very beginning of our webinar today as well, where I mentioned that Barb and I may be SMEs or subject matter experts in experience maps in the healthcare setting, but we are never a subject matter of the journey map itself, or the ones involved in the journey. So for those that would be conducting the interview, I would mention that as well and recommend that as well. They're not the ones to be focused on in the journey map, so you keep that removed. So if you're a user experience researcher or someone else from the team, either let it be an analyst or user experience specialist, they're fantastic and have these skills and these expertise to remain objective and unbiased and to ask the right type of questions in the right format and to elicit the responses they need, because you're not looking at, like Barb mentioned, the solutions right away. That's not what you're looking for and exploring. You're looking for what's happening along this journey. What are people experiencing, these highs and lows, and you're trying to elicit and get at that information. Did you want to add anything there, Barb?
Nope.
Okay.
Got it.
Fantastic.
We have a question from Guy. Do you advocate the use of personas to build out the journey map?
Yeah, so typically, as you mentioned, the journey map will focus around a persona, potentially, you know, if there are multiple personas, like we said, if they are, you know, if there are multiple personas, like we said, if they are different, you should have separate journey maps for them. But you often sort of evolve them together, to be honest. You may have a loose idea of a persona. You're going after a specific, and those may come from sort of a marketing place or something like that, where you have a loose idea of who you're trying to design for. And through the process of gathering this information, many of the same research techniques will fill in your journey map with information, as will fill in your persona with information. So absolutely, those tend to be developed in parallel. And you will sort of pull them up at different times. Both of them kind of are tools, as we mentioned, and you pull them up to do certain jobs. So yes.
Great. Ron has a question. He says, have you ever included artifacts from the contextual research in a journey map?
Ooh, like multimedia cut and paste. That would be a lot of fun.
They're great. I was just going to say, first of all, when doing contextual inquiry, one of my favorite things to do is to, as you're observing somebody and following them around and conducting, you know, ad hoc interviews, that you're always on the lookout for other materials they're using, sticky notes posted around workstations. So I try and grab as many of these types of artifacts as I can, printouts, templates of things, sheets people are filling out, so that I can bring them back to our team and that they have an idea, look, this is what people are using. So it inherently gets lumped into other research and design techniques, and I think it could really support a mapping exercise too.
Yeah, no, it just sounds really fun. I mean, usually the output of a journey map is something digital or at most on paper, physical paper. So the idea of other things being attached to it sort of at a physical level is exciting. It sounds fun. I do think, as Anneliis said, sometimes you just see things. And I mean, now since we all have cameras in our pockets, we absolutely do take pictures of this kind of stuff. I mean, the workarounds we've seen of, you know, 3 Post-its of instructions stuck to a $1 million piece of equipment to help people know how to use it. Absolutely, we capture that kind of stuff, and those are identified as pain points typically.
Yeah.
Nicholas would like to know, he says that you mentioned that it's ideal to use research and develop a map prior to key stakeholders driving a product's development with agendas. Do you have recommendations for when you are introduced to a project later on? or in less ideal circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. Two of the sample maps that we showed in the deck, the one that was just scribbled on paper, that one, honestly, it was something, month 2 of an 8-month project or something where I was just trying to wrap my head around something. And if you at any point identify that understanding is lacking, it's good to fill that understanding, that lack of understanding with understanding, right? If a journey map will do it, then absolutely try and get that in there. But essentially, anytime when you can point out that there is a lack of understanding of the context or the journey or the experience, you're going to want to gain that understanding. So if you can get people to acknowledge that they don't really know the space as well as they should, that they're missing information, that they're making assumptions, no matter where you are in a project, it would be wise to fill that with real information. Ideally, it's up front, but if the information is missing halfway through, fill it.
Yeah, it's a great point that Barb's making. So that's also in the process of a product, but you can also leverage these maps either if the new product or an existing product as well. And I know we've had that question in the past too.
So sort of a follow-on question to this from Brian. He would like to know, what strategies have you used to get stakeholders engaged in these activities and understand the value?
Right. First off, I would like to say just for what I've experienced as a researcher before, if your stakeholders aren't involved from the very beginning, and I don't want to say kind of on board with your activities, but if they don't understand it and the purpose of it and the goal, your research goals and intentions, you're kind of pushing them out of the circle and out of the project space. So it's really important that they're on board from the beginning when you find out these holes like Barb mentioned that you have, and you're like, look, we have this information void that we need to fill. You discuss some ways that you may be able to fill it, and if these are any of the research methods we covered today, and so that they need to understand what you're about to go and what information is going to come from it as well, and how that might inform the hole or the gap that you're missing of information.
I'm also a big fan of sort of the quick and dirty journey mapping thing, as you saw in some of these examples. You don't need to get buy-in or consensus or even permission to spend an hour sketching something out. And once you've sketched it out, and when I say sketch, I don't mean pretty pictures, nice markers, I mean just plotting it out using whatever tools you're most comfortable with. And when you identify these huge areas of missing information and assumptions that you're working on, that's often very effective to get that buy-in. So rather than waiting to get permission to spend 3 weeks doing a journey map or however long you were going to do, it might be worth just spending an hour or two making a mock journey map to show just how much of a mock journey map it is, and to show the assumptions that you're working on. People get very scared when they're working on assumptions, so exposing that is something you can achieve through a very quick and dirty journey map, and then whether you decide to go on with a more thorough journey map or other research activities, you will likely go and start filling those assumptions with real information.
Thanks. Alicia would like to know whether there are qualitative and or quantitative research methods for capturing things like emotional experience, like those blue and pink areas of the journey map example that you showed.
Right, so mentioned on one slide where there was a bunch of green lines going from all the research methods to the types of information you're trying to find. So there are a few research techniques I can think offhand that could help get at the emotional highs and lows. So one of them, in this case of patient journey map, I pulled out the fact that contextual inquiry may not be appropriate. Maybe it's appropriate in another circumstance, so you can gauge and visually see and observe emotional highs and lows. And if possible, probe then with an interview to validate your observations is important, so that, again, you're not making assumptions like Barb was highlighting for us. Also then, if you can't do the contextual inquiry, interviews are great as well, so you can break down kind of the experience they went through and discuss each step of the way of that experience and ask them, probing into their experience on what was happening for them during that time, and aspects that perhaps they didn't like or liked about that experience, and then you'll get these frustrations and these inherent possibly low emotional points along the scale. So interviews, contextual inquiry are great. Observations as well, like I mentioned, could be another research method that it, would provide you with that information.
For our example that we had today, it was a very short as far as the journey goes. I mean, it's at most a day or two long. For some journeys, it's a much longer time period that you're mapping. And in that case, even things like questionnaires and surveys could work very well. So if you have a group of people you're following through a year-long journey or experience, you can have certain questions in that questionnaire that's sent to them on a monthly basis or whatever. And at that point, you can track their emotional state as they report it. So of course, they are reporting it, so you don't know. I mean, how else can you track someone's emotional state, I guess? But at that point, you can map how that has changed over time. So again, that depends on what you're mapping. It wouldn't have worked for this. You're not going to give them questionnaires to fill out at every hour of their labor. But if it's something else, like, you know, a student's experience through the first year of school, for example, you could very well have, you know, if there are multiple personas, like we said, if they are different, you should have separate journey maps for them. But you often sort of evolve them together, to be honest. You may have a loose idea of a persona. You're going after a specific, and those may come from sort of a marketing place or something like that, where you have a loose idea of who you're trying to design for. And through the process of gathering this information, many of the same research techniques will fill in your journey map with information, as will fill in your persona with information. So absolutely, those tend to be developed in parallel. And you will sort of pull them up at different times. Both of them kind of are tools, as we mentioned. And you pull them up to do certain jobs. So yes.
Great. Ron has a question. He says, have you ever included artifacts from the contextual research in a journey map?
Ooh, like multimedia cut and paste. That would be a lot of fun.
They're great. I was just going to say, first of all, when doing contextual inquiry, one of my favorite things to do is to, as you're observing somebody and following them around and conducting, you know, ad hoc interviews, that you're always on the lookout for other materials they're using, sticky notes posted around workstations. So I try and grab as many of these types of artifacts as I can, printouts, templates of things, sheets people are filling out, so that I can bring them back to our team and that they have an idea, look, this is what people are using. So it inherently gets lumped into other research and design techniques, and I think it could really support a mapping exercise too.
Yeah, no, it just sounds really fun. I mean, usually the output of a journey map is something digital or at most on paper, physical paper. So the idea of other things being attached to it sort of at a physical level is exciting. It sounds fun. I do think, as Anneliis said, sometimes you just see things. And I mean, now since we all have cameras in our pockets, we absolutely do take pictures of this kind of stuff. I mean, the workarounds we've seen of, you know, 3 Post-its of instructions stuck to a $1 million piece of equipment to help people know how to use it. Absolutely, we capture that kind of stuff, and those are identified as pain points typically.
Yeah.
Nicholas would like to know, he says that you mentioned that it's ideal to use research and develop a map prior to key stakeholders driving a product's development with agendas. Do you have recommendations for when you are introduced to a project later on, or in less ideal circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. 2 of the sample maps that we showed in the deck, the one that was just scribbled on paper, that one, honestly, it was something, month 2 of an 8-month project or something, where I was just trying to wrap my head around something. And if you at any point identify that understanding is lacking, it's good to fill that understanding, that lack of understanding with understanding, right? If a journey map will do it, then absolutely try and get that in there. But essentially, anytime when you can point out that there is a lack of understanding of the context or the journey or the experience, you're going to want to gain that understanding. So if you can get people to acknowledge that they don't really know the space as well as they should, that they're missing information, that they're making assumptions, no matter where you are in a project, it would be wise to fill that with real information. Ideally, it's up front, but if the information is missing halfway through, fill it.
Yeah, it's a great point that Barb's making. So that's also in the process of a product, but you can also leverage these maps either if the new product or an existing product as well, and I know we've had that question in the past too.
So sort of a follow-on question to this from Brian. He would like to know, what strategies have you used to get stakeholders engaged in these activities and understand the value?
Right. First off, I would like to say just for what I've experienced as a researcher before, if your stakeholders aren't involved from the very beginning, and I don't want to say kind of on board with your activities, but if they don't understand it and the purpose of it and the goal, your research goals and intentions, you're kind of pushing them out of the circle and out of the project space. So it's really important that they're on board from the beginning when you're when you find out these holes like Barb mentioned that you have, and you're like, look, we have this information void that we need to fill, you discuss some ways that you may be able to fill it, and if these are any of the research methods we covered today, and so that they need to understand what you're about to go and what information is going to come from it as well, and how that might inform the hole or the gap that you're missing of information.
I'm also a big fan of sort of the quick and dirty journey mapping thing, as you saw in some of these examples. You don't need to get buy-in or consensus or even permission to spend an hour sketching something out. And once you've sketched it out, and when I say sketch, I don't mean pretty pictures, nice markers, I mean just plotting it out using whatever tools you're most comfortable with. And when you identify these huge areas of missing information and assumptions that you're working on, that's often very effective to get that buy-in. You know, so rather than waiting to get permission to spend 3 weeks doing a journey map or however long you were going to do, it might be worth just spending an hour or two making a mock journey map to show just how much of a mock journey map it is, and to show the assumptions that you're working on. People get very scared when they're working on assumptions, so exposing that is something you can achieve through a very quick and dirty journey map, and then whether you decide to go on with a more thorough journey map or other research activities, you will likely go and start filling those assumptions with real information.
Thanks. Alicia would like to know whether there are qualitative and or quantitative research methods for capturing things like emotional experience, like those blue and pink areas of the journey map example that you showed.
Right, so mentioned on one slide where there was a bunch of green lines going from all the research methods to the types of information you're trying to find. So there are a few research techniques I can think offhand that could help get at the emotional highs and lows. So one of them, in this case of patient journey map, I pulled out the fact that contextual inquiry may not be appropriate. Maybe it's appropriate in another circumstance, so you can gauge and visually see and observe emotional highs and lows. And if possible, probe then with an interview to validate your observations. It's important so that, again, you're not making assumptions like Barb was highlighting for us. Also then, if you can't do the contextual inquiry, interviews are great as well, so you can break down kind of the experience they went through and discuss each step of the way of that experience and ask them, probing into their experience on what was happening for them during that time, and aspects that perhaps they didn't like or liked about that experience, and then you'll get these frustrations and these inherent, possibly low emotional points along the scale. So interviews, contextual inquiry are great. Observations as well, like I mentioned, could be another research method that would provide you with that information.
For our example that we had today, it was a very short as far as the journey goes. I mean, it's at most a day or two long. For some journeys, it's a much longer time period that you're mapping. And in that case, even things like questionnaires and surveys could work very well. So if you have a group of people you're following through a year-long journey or experience, you can have certain questions in that questionnaire that's sent to them on a monthly basis or whatever. And at that point, you can track their emotional state as they report it. So of course, they are reporting it, so you don't know. I mean, how else can you track someone's emotional state, I guess? But at that point, you can map how that has changed over time. So again, that depends on what you're mapping. It wouldn't have worked for this. You're not going to give them questionnaires to fill out at every hour of their labor. But if it's something else, like, a student's experience through the first year of school, for example, you could very well have. It's a very short as far as the journey goes. I mean, it's at most a day or two long. For some journeys, it's a much longer time period that you're mapping. And in that case, even things like questionnaires and surveys could work very well. So if you have a group of people you're following through a year-long journey or experience, you can have certain questions in that questionnaire that's sent to them on a monthly basis or whatever. And at that point, you can track their emotional state as they report it. So of course, they are reporting it, so you don't know. I mean, how else can you track someone's emotional state, I guess? But at that point, you can map how that has changed over time. So again, that depends on what you're mapping. It wouldn't have worked for this. You're not going to give them questionnaires to fill out at every hour of their labor. But if it's something else, like, a student's experience through the first year of school, for example, you could very well have them do like a monthly questionnaire, and you can touch on that kind of stuff. Yeah,
that's a perfect example. So diary studies, something like that, where they're connecting in. For the physical pain, I mean, there's a standardized pain scale a lot of our clinicians use. If they're documenting that, perhaps you can leverage that. That could be your other documentation that you pull out. So
you could steal that from existing records, potentially.
Exactly. So I think to answer it, you can see we mentioned a bunch of research methods. So you can get at those that type of information using a variety of these kind of techniques.
So we have a couple of questions,
Okay.
all related to the same topic. So are the two of you aware of any software that automates the creation of journey maps and enables collaboration in the ongoing evolution and measurement of the customer journey?
So I heard collaboration and I heard creation and automation in that. Okay.
So collaboration on them sounds easier. Like I said, there really isn't a template that I can think of that would do this effectively. I'm sure someone's trying to build one. Maybe there's already one out there. But the idea of using a template for this, it just sounds wrong to me. You know, it's...
Do you have any preferred tools that you guys use?
Sure. So I always start with pen and paper, marker, whiteboard, some variation thereof. Sticky notes work fabulously for going very low tech,
Yeah.
because, like I said, it tends to morph a lot from one thing to another as you're pulling it together. So anything that's sort of malleable and that you can really change as you go. And I think there are certain points in the exercise of doing journey mapping where it's a very sort of interactive thing that people are doing together. So this is the information we have, let's try to organize it, and whether you do that digitally or all in the room together, you can start to put that stuff into place. And then you sort of stop and say, okay, what are we missing, kind of like we did today. And then people go off independently, do research, gather it, come back, and then you sort of have another sort of exercise where you start filling in those gaps. And that maybe you only have to do one round of that, maybe you have to do a few rounds of that. But yeah, I haven't found some automatic, brilliant way of doing it. Maybe it's out there. I'd love to know if it is.
Okay. I guess we have time for two more questions. Here's one from Douglas. He was wondering if maybe you could speak to about how one might use a journey map in an agile development scenario. Is that something that you guys can address?
Sure. So, yeah. So the point at which you'd start on a journey map, for example, okay, so I mean, at the actual agile point of working on it, you know, at any point when you're deciding on details for a specific interaction, you want to come back and make sure it's meeting the needs that are relevant to that point. So, you know, you'll have your list of user stories or something, and having a journey map available to reference, you could very well say, okay, as so-and-so at this point, I want to be able to X, Y, Z. You can still keep those user stories quite short and concise if everybody understands the big picture. So I think having a journey map as kind of your bigger frame of understanding makes all those individual user stories from which you're going to be building in an agile way be more meaningful, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. That said, I think you would have to have that journey map relatively well defined before that first line of code is being written. You'd want to have the research done, right?
So just to continue, again from Douglas, he was just asking, it looks, from what you've presented, it looks like a combination of sequence diagrams together with use case models. And he sees it helping in the business understand and agree on the overall flow of what a product will do that supports some process, but he doesn't see it drilling down enough for a developer to actually code something. Is he missing something?
Right. There's a couple of things that first jumped out at me in that statement as well. One was that the overall process of a product. So it may not be because this is one experience with the product. So perhaps the persona is only leveraging parts or portions of the product or service. So it's not necessarily giving the experience of the entire product in terms of all its features and functionality. So that was one thing that I think we can clarify with what the experience map is showing versus what we're showing that the product can or service can or can't do. So that was one thing that stuck out for me. So I just wanted to clarify that at first. Sorry, Barb.
Sure. Yeah, the other thing that you just mentioned, when you mentioned the process of using a product with a sequence, I think often the initial journey mapping exercise that you might do will be in order to decide what you're going to build, you know. So are we designing a solution for, you know, the moment, you know, this woman has her first contraction? Are we designing a solution for announcing the baby's birth? You know, the initial journey map may be done in order to target your product, right? And then at that point, maybe you do zoom in to sort of a much more granular level on that very small area of your journey map, and then start to figure out, like you said, a little bit more about the specific steps that happen that you need to support. As far as being able to build and implement something from a journey map, no, there's stuff in between there. This will lead into, like we said, usage scenarios, wireframes, and from those wireframes, presumably you can build something.
So a question would be, what's the handoff then from the journey maps? Do you hand that off to wireframe developers? Like, what's the next stage?
So I would think a journey map feeds most directly into design, but then sort of continues along with the whole project to
because it's acting as a frame of reference, right?
Yeah.
Like you're mentioning before in your last response for developers, they can always come back and check with their use scenarios back to that larger frame of reference of where the product or service lives.
Yeah, like there are activities that need to happen after journey mapping before implementing.
All right, I think at this point we're running out of time, so thanks Barb, thanks Anneliis. For everyone who's still on the bridge, I will be consolidating all the questions and we will be sending out answers to the questions along with a copy of the recording and the slides following the webinar. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll hope you join us on our next webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you.